In today's Elden Ring video, we'll take a look at a build that exclusively focuses on gravity spells and sorceries. I always like the idea of having a character manipulating gravity. Most of the options in this regard are already really strong in Elden Ring, so this was a natural progression to what this build is today. Now this is going to be a hybrid build, a mix between strength and intelligence that will take advantage of both melee and range attacks, while providing heavy amounts of stagger against enemies and bosses, and also very high damage. Now the main weapon we'll use with this build is going to be the Great Star Hammer. Reason being is the fact that this reaches a high AR on its own, has great scaling despite having a relatively low strength requirement of just 22, and changing its Ash of War still leaves its blood buildup intact, so that's some nice extra damage on top. It's also a pretty easy drop you can find in the back of a caravan just south of the Road of Iniquity, Side of Grace, and it still has a passive effect on it that will heal you about 1% of your HP for every enemy you kill around you. In terms of the Ashes of War, we're gonna make use of the really excellent Waves of Darkness. You get these by defeating Astel, the natural born optional boss that you can find after passing the Lake of Rot during Ranni's questline, so you will have to use his remembrance back at the hold to get the Ash of War, but it's totally worth it. This will unleash a very strong series of 3 gravity waves at the point of impact that deal extremely high damage and do a great job at interrupting enemies, and yes, this includes bosses as well. Now each wave becomes progressively more extended, but you don't just want to hit the enemy with the waves but also with the weapon itself, so if you do that you will maximize your damage, and because the weapon has some bleed on it, you can also maybe pop off a bleed build-up in the meantime for even more crazy damage. In many of the situations that can mean anywhere between 5 to 8, even 10,000 damage with just one single cast depending on the enemy. Now this weapon art actually scales off your attack rating but also gets influenced by your intelligence scaling and also the buffs that you might apply to your weapon. We're gonna go over some tests in just a little bit, but this is the reason why we want to use the Scholar's Armament to buff up the damage even more for both the primary weapon attack but also for the subsequent spells. This brings us to the setup, and this is the way you're going to want to set up this whole idea out with this build to make the most out of the Ashes of War, and of course you're going to want to use them with a non-magic affinity. Reason being is because if you use a non-magic type of affinity with this Ash of War, you can also further buff the weapon with either greases or other enchants, which in this case that would obviously be that Scholar's Armament. Also you will want to use the heavy affinity in this case, since this further increases your strength scaling, and that's a nice bit of extra damage, even though like strength is not the primary focus of this build. Now since Scholar's Armament scales off your sorcery scaling, you will also want to mix in an Academy Glintstone Staff with this, especially if you are below 68 in intelligence. This is by far the best staff in the game that will provide the highest sorcery scaling when you're below 68 intelligence and doesn't have any mana cost penalty like how Lusat's staff does. If you're over 68 intelligence, at that point you will want to switch to the Carrion Regal Scepter, which will obviously provide a much better bonus. If you're progressing through the game, you can also maybe take a look at the Meteorite Staff. It's definitely an option if you don't have either of these two, and it's also going to give you a nice bonus damage to the Rock Sling, which is also going to get used with this build as well. Now doing some tests between intelligence and strength with this build revealed that gravity waves alone had a significant increase in damage with high intelligence. Meanwhile, the actual weapon damage, as in the component of the damage that came straight from the weapon itself, would get a significant boost, obviously from higher strength. That being said, if we were to compare the straight up damage between these two setups, obviously the one with high intelligence and the Scholar Armament provided way higher damage, since this affects both the weapon and the waves likewise, and you also get the benefits from the intelligence and other intelligence related buffs. So this is the reason why we're going with this particular setup and not fully focusing on strength. Now in terms of some of the items, we're using the Crown of Haima. It's going to give us 2 points into strength and intelligence. We do need those to reach those points earlier, but it does give you a 10% FP penalty, so you do have to keep that in mind. Furthermore, since our primary damage is going to be magic based, we're making use of the Shard of Alexander to buff up the weapon skill itself, and also a Magic Scorpion Charm to buff up the magic damage on these spells. This build isn't too hard on the mana consumption, but if you want to like spare even more mana on the weapon art, obviously you can go ahead and add a filigreed crest, which can help reduce that by a significant amount, resulting in only a 12 FP consumption cost per each cast of the Waves of Darkness, which is extremely efficient when you consider you're dealing over 5,000 per each of these attacks, which is coming in super easily. The final one, which is something that helped me reach my goal faster, was Radagon's Source Seal. I went deep into intelligence with this build, so I needed a bit of extra strength, but you can also go vice versa with a Marika Source Seal and get more intelligence instead if you are in a different situation. Now let's go over some of the strategies and playstyles you can use with this build. Now this build makes heavy use, as I've said, of not just gravity related spells including the Waves of Darkness, but also the Rock Sling and the Gravity Well. It's a matter of choice which ones you want to use to start a fight with. You can obviously start with a quick Rock Sling and then jump in with a weapon art, or vice versa. Doing so will likely stun the enemy quickly, and if it has enough HP to even resist that amount of damage, you can just follow up with a critical strike to completely finish them off. Alternatively, you can also start with the waves themselves from the weapon and then also maybe disengage in case the enemy becomes too overwhelming for you, and you can just cast a couple of Rock Slings from afar and then jump in back with the waves. This is especially useful against bosses when they might enter a devastating phase, when if you're too close to them they might deal too much damage. You can just stay back from safety and just use the Rock Slings from afar. But you can also preemptively use the Waves of Darkness to cast them into the ground, and if there's any enemy that walks into them, they either die immediately for regular enemies or completely get interrupted for some of the bigger ones. My favorite though is especially against annoying enemies that tend to group up against you that might be a little bit too mobile. You can simply stay back or maybe hug a corner, cast a Wave of Darkness, and yeah, they will eventually walk into them because the extended range and the timer on these will eventually affect everybody that gets close to you. So overall, you're going to be safer when you're casting that Wave of Darkness than if you were to maybe cast something else. Now, another sorcery that works extremely well here is going to be the Gravity Well, another thing you can get quite early from the Rhea Lucaria Academy. The Rock Sling tends to get wasted in tight spaces since it can easily hit obstacles, but if you use the Gravity Well, this travels in a completely straight line and also has a very long reach. Not only so, but you can also use this to pull targets towards you, so this is going to be a great way to cause enemies to fall over ledges and immediately die, so you don't have to deal with them. My favorite though is going to be against bosses. Obviously this is, I think, where the build shines the most. You're going to be able to deal a ton of damage. You barely get interrupted in your animation when you cast the Waves of Darkness, but there are some that can cancel those animations, maybe even the full-on waves. If you do unleash them, at least the first one, even if you fall on your butt or if the enemy interrupts you, the subsequent waves will continue to do damage in that spot, so that can be a great way to continuously provide some additional damage when you're actually not casting anything. Your main goal, as I said, is to not just hit enemies with the waves though, but also with the primary weapon that also has its own damage component. It further benefits from the armament, but since you also have 55 bleed build up in a couple of shots, you can also cause some of that to immediately pop and provide some additional secondary damage, which is actually quite welcomed with this build. Now, there's other cool interactions you can create with these types of gravity weapon arts. This doesn't just apply to the Waves of Darkness, but also to the Gravitas, which you can acquire quite early in the game, as in pretty much they will spread any weapon enchant that you currently have on that weapon when you don't use a magical Ash of War. So for example, if you were to use a similar setup but with a Faith build and then apply either Black or Blood Flames, you could spread those effects to any other target that is affected by these spells. And I've tested this with both of these, and yes, it fully works with those spells, but obviously that's a different kind of setup and not the point of this video. Again, totally try it out. There's many possibilities with this build. You can stay further back or get close to the enemy, you can jump or just cast spells from afar. Overall, it's right now my go-to build that has carried me in my second journey as well, even against some of the toughest bosses. But this is it with the build. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.